Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ben Thomas with UST Training, usttraining.com. We provide online Class A, B, and C UST operator training nationwide. And today I'm excited to have my friend John Kelly with Titan Cloud give a presentation cutting through the noise. John, I think you and I share a similar vision of what I call the liking to continuously build a better mousetrap. There's always a better way to do what we need to do. And those who know me know I've been trying to advance technological uses of UST compliance since long time ago. As early as 1997, I had developed a state of Alaska underground tank webpage to deliver technical services, getting away from the fax and phone calls and letters and brochures and all that sort of stuff. And so since that time, I've just had a kind of a career-long passion in basically making things better for UST operators and by default, UST inspectors as well. And so I think with that, John, I'll just have you give a kind of quick introduction about yourself and just kind of jump right in.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate the invitation to be here today, and thank you everybody for joining us. I know everyone's got a lot going on, so appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to spend with us this afternoon or morning, whatever time zone you're in. As Ben said, my name's John Kelly. I'm with Titan Cloud Software, and today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the advances that we've seen in UST alarm management more recently. As Ben pointed out, he's certainly been an evangelist for applying technology to UST compliance in whatever form possible for many years. And there are some exciting, approaches, I think, to making life a little bit easier, making sort of taking some of the risk out of owning underground storage tanks, which is obviously a significant component of UST ownership, and making sure that you're operating your business as efficiently as possible and achieving compliance cost effectively as well. So I'll go through some of the trends and patterns that we've seen over time, and then share some of the some case studies for what happens when UST alarm management goes wrong, and then some of the ways that people maybe try and put preventative measures in place to avoid those in the future. This is a presentation that I gave to a group that Ben was hosting a few weeks ago, I think it was, maybe sometime in September, Ben, if my memory serves.
Yeah.
And we found that it was very useful when people were sharing comments, asking questions. It was quite conversational. So I know sometimes it's a little bit, that was in person. This is a webinar. I know sometimes it's a little bit easier for that to be done in person, but don't hesitate to use the chat or the Q&A or whatever to make your voice heard here today as well. We'd love to have your involvement and engagement throughout the presentation.
And John, I'll be monitoring the Q&A box. And so please, if you have a question, we would love to pause at any time along the way and ask John a question. I'll be watching that, John. So I'll jump in and interrupt before we get to the next slide if there's something we need to unpack any particular area.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ben. All right. Well, I'll just get things started here. All right. Looks like we're working. So just a quick bit, little background about Titan Cloud, who I work for. We are a software vendor that provides connectivity and sort of data management for all sorts of petroleum equipment, predominantly focused on automatic tank gauges and all of that. The company's been growing significantly over the last few years through a combination of organic growth and acquisitions. I came to the company through the acquisition of Canary Compliance, which was a company that I'd started here in Philadelphia. And most recently, Titan acquired Leighton O'Brien, which many of you may be familiar with. And that's an exciting change and new chapter for the organization that we're embarking on here. We certainly monitor an awful lot of facilities, about half the US, gasoline that's going through stations every day. We've got our digital eyes on and have an extensive footprint. But what this means for you today is that we've got lots of data and use cases that potentially can help you understand the landscape of alarm management and alarm monitoring, and the best ways of approaching it. The way I always like to start conversations around alarm management and ATG management and that sort of thing is through a framework that I call the tank owner-operator hierarchy of needs. This comes from a sort of business school concept called Maslow's hierarchy of need. Some of you may be familiar with that, but essentially what it means is that for someone to really achieve the sort of fulfillment and all that type of stuff, there are certain pieces of the pyramid that need to go in place beforehand. So, you can't be achieving sort of personal fulfillment if you're not eating. So you've got to eat first, you got to sleep, you got to have community, you got to have friends, you got to have this and that, and then eventually you get to the kind of more aspirational pieces of it. And that's the framework that they use in kind of business school for consumer psychology and stuff like that. But as we talk to customers over the years, we found that there's a way of applying this same concept of sort of layering different priorities and how some need to get met before you can start to think about other things. And when I gave this presentation a few weeks ago in San Antonio, Ben brought up the fact that often within the sort of ecosystem of UST sort of monitoring stakeholders, different people have very different perspectives on what is important. And to just keep in mind that this is what we try to provide this perspective from the overall view of a fuel retail organization who is buying and selling fuel and also owning and operating facilities. Ben found it, interesting from his former life as a regulator to think about, what are the fundamental things that fuel retailers really care about? Why are they important? And how might that actually be useful context for a regulator to understand or an inspector to understand when they're coming in and looking at a facility from strictly a compliance standpoint? So basically, the first thing that matters for someone who owns a tank or a few facilities with tanks or hundreds of facilities with tanks is establishing connectivity to the equipment, making sure that you can get the equipment data quickly, securely, reliably. Now, connectivity can mean a lot of different things. Connectivity is technically calling the store and asking someone to go to the back room and check what's on the Vita route right now. It's not a very good method of connectivity, but it is a method of connectivity. More sophisticated and advanced, operators are obviously dialing directly into the tank monitor through some kind of internet-enabled connection, whether it's a cellular gateway or through their on-site network, whatever. But without any kind of connectivity to your equipment, you can't do anything about it because you don't know what's going on. So that's paramount, and we come from the world of remote tank monitoring software. And what we've seen is that it doesn't matter how good your software is, if you're not connected to the equipment, the software is not much good. So connectivity, super, super important. The next thing that customers who own and operate facilities tend to think about is optimizing their fuel inventory. Now, the lifeblood of a facility is obviously its gasoline. You don't want to run out because you're immediately losing profitability because customers aren't coming to your store anymore. It's bad PR, all those sorts of things. In addition to that, you can't just continue to, order fuel and all that blindly. You've got to make sure you're optimizing your cash flow, buying at the right time, getting a good deal, getting the right price, all that sort of stuff. And then furthermore, minimizing variance, making sure that there's no loss happening while you're actually, buying and selling that fuel within your facility. That is really paramount to a fuel retailer to make sure that information is critically managed. And so I think a lot of times, what people who are focused strictly on the compliance side may fail to realize is that this is really kind of for the executive leadership or whatever, a fuel retailer, this is number one on the priority list because of the fact that it truly does drive the bottom line in such a significant way. However, once you've taken care of optimizing your fuel inventory, it's very important to make sure that you're doing so in compliance with the local rules and regulations and the federal rules and regulations. You cannot operate a facility without understanding and meeting the leak detection or testing requirements. You have to document what you've done and ensure that you can prove that you're compliant within the jurisdiction that you're operating. And so, that obviously matters a great deal. But then potentially you could spend a lot of money on compliance, but again, kind of doing it without thinking, you might be overspending on compliance. And so what we then see people say is, okay, now I've achieved compliance, but am I achieving compliance as cost effectively as I can? Am I minimizing my downside? Am I achieving, the sort of most optimum risk profile of my facility and making sure that I'm doing so in a cost-effective way and making sure that when customers come in, they're getting a really good experience in my facility? you can't really get to that point until you've addressed all of these other things. And that's why we have it kind of in this framework here. But I think this is just helpful context for people who, own and operate facilities to think about if they're only looking at one slice of this triangle, or for people that are maybe in the regulatory community that, don't always think about things outside of the compliance lens, because that's the one that you're focused on day in and day out.
I was just going to jump in. I mean, as a former regulator myself, I remember kind of early on in my career, kind of being shocked when I get to a gas station and people weren't that slice number 3 and 4 weren't kind of the first thing that they woke up and thought about in the morning. I mean, you got crime, you got homelessness, you got people showing up late for work, you have inventory coming in all day. I mean, I spent all day at gas stations all over the country doing various this and that, and it's astonishing how many people come in the front door. Food handling inspectors, OSHA, and it's this constant kind of barrage of stuff. And it's easy to it was helpful for me to kind of realize that there's an awful lot going on at a convenience store or really any UST site, and operators are, I think, charged with an awful lot of stuff to do. And so it was kind of humbling for me to realize that even though I would prefer compliance to be, number one, in reality, it's not always the case, just given the speed and complexity and just density, what happens at our typical convenience store.
Absolutely. You raise a great point. A former colleague of mine worked for a very large retailer for a while, and he said that when he joined the company, for a week, I think it was, he had to work in one of their convenience stores behind the register. And it was funny because, we were focusing on tank monitors and, always talking about how the monitor is beeping all the time and so on and so forth. And he said, you would not believe the number of things that beep in a convenience store. Everything is always beeping. The door beeps when someone walks in. The fridge beeps when the door is left open. The laundry machine beeps when it's out of paper. The cash register beeps whenever someone scans anything. There's just beeps all over the place all the time. And so it's very difficult to, kind of discern which beep is important and which one's not, when you're in there. And he made the same point about the number of people that come in and out of convenience stores with, their task is the number one priority for them. But, for the person who's actually on site or the person who's responsible for what's happening on site, they may have a different list of priorities. So I think it's just, again, kind of useful perspective and context for people within, even just this, we're only here talking about the tank piece of it. There's lots of other stuff going on in convenience stores as well. But even within the tanks, there's a kind of hierarchy of how people think about stuff.
And the more I think about it, John, if you're in a big enough company, you have a different department for each one of these layers.
Right. And no one wants to sort of subordinate themselves to another department because it doesn't feel so good. So anyway, but that's, hopefully that's useful. I don't know if there are any feedback or comments from the group on this, if it's a useful framework to think about or not. But if you have any thoughts, feel free to share them in the chat. So, one of the other kind of important pieces of context that we think is critical for people to understand and appreciate when it comes to alarm monitoring is that over time, what we've seen is this shift from single wall to double wall systems. And that's great, right? Because it's, in theory, at least, gonna provide greater leak detection, or really greater leak prevention if you've got double walled containment that you're using instead of single walled containment. However, for the operator, what double wall containment means is that there are many more sensors that need to be monitored, that need to be tested, that need to be, taken care of and all that sort of stuff. And so there's a whole host of things that need to get met from a compliance standpoint these days that didn't need to happen before. If you've got double-walled tanks, you have interstitial sensors. If you have double-walled pipes, you have interstitial sensors. Any of these things, you got extra sensors that you're now having to pay annually to get tested from a functionality standpoint. And then you have to respond to if they ever give you any kind of indication of a leak. And so, that's just, I think, some important, again, context for people to understand that operators are continuing to have to deal with more and more stuff just to continue to meet compliance. And, when it's just a pass-fail test, it's sort of, you've got more to do to pass. And so the onus is really on the operator from that standpoint. And this is an interesting, I think, sort of chart here that shows you over time new installations. What are we seeing in terms of how many more, what proportion of double wall tanks versus single wall tanks And obviously, over time, more and more and more of the tanks that are going in the ground are double walled, which just means that there's going to be that heightened scrutiny and increased requirements in terms of what you're doing, what you're documenting, what you're responding to, what you're monitoring, and all of that. One of the things that we've just touched on briefly here is ATG, automatic tank gauge alarms. And over the course of my sort of 10 or so years working in the ATG space, really focused on alarms, what I've kind of distilled it down to is that there are three core reasons that people don't respond to alarms when maybe they should. The first is that they don't know about alarms. We talked about connectivity before, and the reality is if someone doesn't know that the machine in the back room is beeping and it has to do with some sort of tank related issue, then how can they ever respond to it? So if they don't know about it, they can't do anything about it. If they don't understand ATG alarms, they often decide that there's no action worth taking because they don't really know what it means. And tank monitors are incredibly sophisticated pieces of equipment. However, it can be quite difficult to decipher the jargon that is coming out of them. I don't know many folks that work behind the register at a C store that could tell you what CSLD stands for, let alone what to do when a CSLD rate increase warning is detected on a tank monitor. And that's nothing against those folks. It's just that's technical jargon that many people on this call may not know what CSLD stands for. I'm sure a lot do, but it's the kind of thing that's not necessarily intuitive. And with the old Veeder-Root 350s, that still are kind of the majority of the monitors that are out there. There's only 2 lines of text on the top there. And so all you see is CSLD rate increase warning. And if you don't know what that means, then what are you going to do about it? Maybe you call someone, maybe you don't. It's much easier to take action on something if you know how important it is. And then the last one is that sometimes, unfortunately, there are people that don't care about ATG alarms. That may be malicious. It may be the fact that they aren't prioritizing them. I'm going to assume it's more likely the latter than the former, based on the operators that I know that are out there. But that obviously is sometimes something that happens. Now, the question is, how do we solve for this, right? So what do we do if people don't know about ATG alarms? What do we do if people don't understand ATG alarms? If people don't care about ATG alarms, that's more of a cultural problem. That hopefully education and UST operator training and stuff like that will help people, recognize that it is something that is worth paying attention to and caring about. But the first two, I think, are very solvable things, especially with the state of modern technology. Every major tank monitor manufacturer that is out there has the ability to be connected to remotely. So there's really no excuse these days for not knowing about tank monitor alarms, since you can establish connectivity pretty reliably and easily these days with simple solutions. The tough one is about understanding ATG alarms and figuring out how to cut through the noise, which is the title of this webinar session here, to make sure that you're really figuring out what you need to pay attention to, what it really means, what's the context, do I need to take action or not? And that's where some of the more recent advances in technology are providing some real value to customers. And I'll get into that in a couple of slides here with some case studies. But Ben, did you have any thoughts or comments on this before I keep moving ahead?
I was just going to say, whatever training you provide your employees, ABC or otherwise, the training simply has to explain this. I mean, I never run into people who go, "Oh yeah, L4 fuel alarm. That's my diesel's Northwest turbine sensor." And, people just don't get that. And so here at UST Training, we go to great length to say, you've either got pass, fail, or inconclusive, and what do you do under each action? So it really does take, I think, good training. In fact, when we do Class C operator training, we just say, and that's assuming with or without remote monitoring, if it's blinking red, call your supervisor. Could be a problem. I mean, your training, whatever training you get, really should need to lay that out, because I think we did, like you were saying earlier, John, all the beeps. You just can't assume that someone can go in the back room and look at the tank monitor and make sense of what it is and determine its kind of risk to the operation. So yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
No questions so far, John.
Excellent. We'll keep moving forward. So this is really where this kind of comes into focus, I think. So this is an example that we took from a customer that had 700 UST facilities and we tracked all their data over the course of 2 months. And what was nice about this particular sort of analysis that we did was that we were actually integrated with their work order management system. So we knew when a dispatch was ultimately sent out to the facility for corrective action to be taken by a field service technician, which is very helpful because the objective of this was to say, okay, how many alarms are going off? How many times did someone actually have to do something? And what happened in between? And so I'll explain this funnel here. So basically what we had was over 700 sites in the course of 60 days or 2 months. There were 30,000 total occurrences of tank monitor alarms. That to us initially was sort of head spinning in terms of the volume of alarms that were taking place at a facility on a given day. And we said, what on earth is going on here? How is that number so high? How are these facilities still operational? This doesn't even make sense. And so we said, all right, let's peel back some of this stuff, because we know that not all Veeder-Root alarms are created equal, or tank monitor alarms are created equal. You know, what's really happening here? And so we stripped out the ones that we didn't think were necessarily compliance related: paper out, paper jam, low product, you know, those sorts of things. And we said, okay, how many of these are actually compliance related? You know, maybe there's just a bunch of nuisance alarms or things like that that we don't need to be paying attention to. But there was still 17,000 compliance related alarms. And we thought, goodness me, this is really a massive volume of information for people to try and make sense of. But then as we evaluated further what was actually happening, we saw that in many cases, you had an individual issue that was triggering many occurrences of the same alarm. So you might have a sensor where the wiring has gone bad, and because the wiring's bad, the sensor is going in and out of alarm constantly, every few minutes potentially, until somebody addresses the wiring issue. And so even though you might have 1,000 L4 sensor alarms, what's actually going on is you have one issue you need to take care of. The wiring's bad on the sensor. The same thing can apply to a tank probe where the wiring's gone bad. And then you may have other situations where, you know, sort of a phantom alarm is occurring where it's gone on and gone off, you know, on its own. And so we said, okay, in reality, you know, there's probably a big buildup of alarms that's going on here, many of which aren't actually actionable. So let's figure out which ones are actually actionable in some way, shape, or form. And when we looked through all the sort of notes that this client had with respect to how they were analyzing and interpreting the alarms and all of this and where they were actually taking action, it only came down to 2,000 actual issues, which, when you think about it, is a much more manageable number over the course of 60 days at 700 facilities. And they were leveraging some kind of software rules and all this to help them interpret alarms to get down to the root cause more quickly, because 17,000 was just way too many for them to pore over. So when they got it down to 2,000 issues, some of those were things they could troubleshoot remotely by dialing in to the tank monitor and updating settings or running a test or something like that without actually visiting the store. And then 350 only were ones that actually required someone to physically go to the facility to address the issue, solve it, you know, clear the alarm and get the facility back into compliance. And so, you know, the question for operators who are out there is, okay, you know, the total number of alarms is going to be super high, and you know that the actual number of things you need to do is going to be relatively low. How are you going to bridge that gap? How are you going to find these needles in the haystack, or cut through the noise to find the signal that should drive your facility maintenance spend? Because otherwise, you're either going to be over responding or under responding, because things can get lost if there's too much going on. So that's where, you know, as I mentioned, we won't get into, you know, too many specifics as to how the technology works. That's, you know, I'm happy to discuss that later, but essentially, you know, rules engines and sophisticated algorithms that are helping get to the root cause more quickly are the ways to do this these days, especially if you're operating at scale.
These are kind of big, heady numbers here. So, I mean, 7% of the time, a compliance-related alarm is an actual issue. I mean, that's 7 times out of 100. It's like something that requires an action, and then it's like less than like 2% of the time you actually have to dispatch out there. I mean, I find myself a little frustrated with what would appear to be kind of the inefficiency of automatic tank gauges. Is that fair to say? I mean, you know, well, 98% of the time you don't need to dispatch someone out there, and so. I think especially for like a small owner operator, it would be very frustrating. I mean, you know, we're kind of like into the boy who cried wolf kind of story here, where it kind of looks bad, but it's not. So I don't know.
Well, I think, you know, I mean, you could say that, but also I think, it's inevitable that, sometimes things that have electrical wiring are going to have wiring problems. And so, these sorts of things, it's difficult to blame that on the tank monitor and the manufacturer or something like that. This is just sort of the reality of this sort of physical equipment. It's going to be subject to this. And also we're dealing with facilities where, people are on these sites basically 24 hours a day, or at least as long as they're open. There's always stuff happening at facilities. And so there's, high likelihood a lot of this stuff, these false alarms get triggered by, deliveries. The probe gets kind of rattled around or something like that. There's a small splash into the spill bucket, during the delivery that triggers an alarm that goes off, or, whatever. And the guy's right there and he, removes the fuel and problem solved. But, this is all just the reality of operating a fueling facility, which is a very complicated, place to be.
Yeah, fair enough.
So the other thing that we also found as a part of this, and then, with some other case studies, was that in many cases, tank monitors are only as good, well, in all cases, tank monitors are only as good as the settings that have been programmed on them. And so this gets back to the boy who cried wolf type of a thing. In some cases, if the settings are programmed incorrectly on a tank monitor, you can either over or underreact. And this example here is from a separate client where what happened was, we were speaking with them and they were saying, oh yeah, we have this great system, within our company where what we do is we prohibit deliveries anytime any tank of ours has more than 1 inch of water in it. And we said, wow, that's a brilliant, idea. You won't have any phase separation or contaminated fuel or anything like that. I said, how do you enforce that? He said, well, whenever we know that there's more than 1 inch of water in the tank, we notify our carriers that they're not allowed to deliver fuel. We said, great, sounds good. Clearly, not much that we can help with. It sounds like everything's working out pretty well. About 6 weeks later, we got a call from them and they said, hey, we just had a problem. Someone dropped fuel into a tank that was full of water, had phase separation, 6 cars broke down with the contaminated fuel. Obviously a big PR issue for the, local community. People kind of blacklisted that station and so on and so forth. And what we ended up, they said, how can you help us? And we said, okay, well, let's just check to see what's going on with all your tank monitors. So we established remote connectivity and we were able to audit every one of the tank monitors to see if in fact the settings were correct, where they would have been notified by the monitor and through a remote connection to the monitor of a situation where the water level was above 1 inch. And what we found was that although there are 2 separate alarms on a tank monitor to provide you with advance notice of rising water, one being the high water limit, one being the high water warning, you can set those at different levels. So you kind of get 2 notices of what's going on. Not one of the tanks, not a single one, had the high water limit programmed at 1 inch. It was programmed maybe at 0.5 inches or 2 inches or 1.5 or 6 inches or 12 inches. Who knows? It was all over the map, what we found. And the high water limit, only 9% of the tanks were programmed at 1.5 inches, which is where the customer thought they were supposed to be. So what this revealed is that the client had this policy, yet the tank monitor was not allowing them to enable that policy because the settings were programmed incorrectly. That completely undermines everything. When we learned this, we tied it back to what we saw with that funnel from the previous slide, which was the volume of alarms that go, that don't require action. And we actually looked back and did some retroactive analysis, and it turned out a lot of the alarms were because the settings were incorrectly programmed in the first case. And so, obviously, you want to make sure that you're not getting notified about something either too early or too late so that you can take the appropriate corrective action in the event that something goes on. Tank monitor alarm management really, from my perspective, comes down to data integrity. And if your settings are programmed incorrectly, then you're not going to have reliable data that you can act on. I don't think this customer was doing this in any kind of malicious way, but tank monitor settings can get scrambled a little bit if a technician's in there. For people who have got the Veeder-Root 350s, with the keypads, sometimes the numbers get a little stuck. And so maybe a technician's kind of banging back and forth to get it to 1.5. And, after a while, the key isn't reading and it ends up at 5.1 instead. This type of thing can happen innocently, but can have a significant impact on the business. And so unless you've got some way of monitoring those settings on an ongoing basis to detect either unauthorized or unexpected changes to the settings, and any kind of variance from where you would expect them to be, then you are creating risk within your operation and potentially either going to have more noise or situations where you have less noise, like these folks, and they didn't find out about something when they needed to.
John, I would have hoped after the requirement for annual HEG certification, this number should have improved. I don't know if we can dip back in time long enough
Yeah,
to.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know, but I think even with annual ATG certification, I know there are some service providers on the phone, and there are inexperienced service technicians out there that maybe it's their first time doing a tank monitor certification or something, and they miss a setting or something like that, or again the numbers get stuck. These things can happen innocently. There could be a lightning strike after the certification's done, and then someone has to reprogram it, and maybe they take a shortcut because it's busy or something like that. These things can just kind of happen. Again, we're dealing with these facilities where they don't operate in a vacuum. These are very live sites, as any operator will tell you. And I think that's very important context for the regulatory community, particularly to understand the kind of challenges that the real world present to operators who are probably with operating with the best of intentions, I would assume, based on my experience working in the industry for so long. So yeah, I mean, this is just, there are obviously ways these days, how do you solve for this? There are digital configuration management tools that are out there, that will allow you to set them, get notified about, any changes that are either unauthorized and, kind of reset them to what your sort of company thresholds are, so on and so forth. It allows you to make sure that you've got the data integrity that you're looking for, and it helps you keep a bit of a paper trail, so there's accountability in the event that something does occur later on down the road. So that's just technology to be aware of out there these days to help mitigate that problem. The last case study that I'm going to talk on, because Ben, how are we doing on time?
You're doing great, John. We got plenty of time. Take your time.
Great. So the last one that I'm going to talk about here is a situation where there was a retailer that strictly used, they didn't have any internal maintenance techs, so they strictly used third-party maintenance to respond to any sorts of issues that came up at their facilities. And the way that this retailer had set things up was they did have remote connectivity established to their tank monitors. However, they were using a relatively basic method of aggregating alarm notifications. So they would get sort of a digest that would say, hey, this site had this type of alarm, this site had this type of alarm, here's when it occurred, so on and so forth. And they had an environmental analyst who was responsible for taking action on all of this. And this analyst was relatively new to the industry, again, very well-intentioned, wanted to do the right thing. But what was happening was, without the deep knowledge of tank monitors, without the context of how different alarms what can trigger different alarms and root causes and all that sort of stuff, this analyst depended on a list that had been handed down from one environmental analyst to the next over the years of what they called hot alarms. And so the hot alarms were ones that they considered to be really high risk. A sensor alarm, a PLLD shutdown alarm, these sorts of things that are an indication of either the facility is not pumping fuel anymore because it's gone into a shutdown, or there's an indication of the presence of liquid, so therefore you're going to have to take action on that with someone visiting the site. And so again, they were taking a very cautious approach and responding to all of these things that could potentially indicate that there was some sort of risk. That's great. However, it comes at a cost. And so what we saw was that across 50 sites, they were on average dispatching 70 times per month for these hot alarms that were occurring. We provided we took their remote connectivity, and then we layered on top of that some more sophisticated analysis technology that was looking at the alarms, not just taking them at surface value, but doing a little bit further, a little bit more analysis on what the root cause might be, so that the person who's responsible for taking action was operating with better understanding of the context around the alarm, as opposed to just what the type of the alarm was. And let me explain why that matters in this particular context. PLLD shutdown alarms, they are quite common occurrences. I'm sure many people on this call have heard of those before. What they do is they actually shut down the dispenser from running. It's a sort of positive shutdown thing where there's an indication of a potential leak, and so the system shuts down. Obviously, very frustrating for a retailer when that happens, but it could be an environmental risk, so that's why the system was set up that way. The problem is That alarm, if all you know is that it's a PLLD shutdown alarm, all you know is that your site's shut down, and all you know is that you've got to send someone out to take care of it. However, there are three potential causes of that alarm. The first is that you have an environmental catastrophe where you're actually leaking fuel into out of your system. And yes, you do need to respond to that very, very quickly and get somebody out there. However, that alarm can also be triggered by the fact that you have had maybe two people pumping at the same time and pressure has built up in the line. And so that alarm can go off. However, that is not an environmental emergency. It's something that can be cleared out if you recycle the test. The third thing that can trigger that alarm is that your tank has run out of fuel. What happens when the tank runs out of fuel is that it stops pumping, because if it continues to pump when there's no fuel, it will burn out the motor that is responsible for pumping the fuel out into the piping system. And so what you've got there is the same alarm, the same headline, PLLD shutdown, the same outcome, your site's not pumping fuel, but three very different reasons for that alarm to have occurred in the first place, and three very different ways of responding to that alarm in order to get your site back operational again. If it's a PLLD shutdown triggered by an environmental emergency, you got to get somebody out there. If it's triggered by you having too little fuel in the tank, you need a delivery, not a service technician and a remediation crew. And if it's triggered by the pressure buildup in the line, you can remotely clear that alarm by cycling that test again if you have remote access to your tank monitor. So as you can see, you might have something where an environmental analyst who is sending out service providers every single time, many of those times, the person's arriving at the facility, the tech is arriving at the facility to take care of the issue, and they get there and say, nothing I can really do, you're out of fuel, you actually need a delivery, not a service technician. By the way, here's a bill for $500 because I drove all the way out here. That doesn't feel very good if you're the operator. And it's certainly very, very avoidable if you have the right technology in place to help you interpret those alarms in real time, so you're not learning the expensive way what's really going on. And so to tie it back to this case study, what we saw was that by implementing this technology that was helping them get to the root cause much more quickly, they over-halved the number of dispatches that were going off, because there were so many of these PLLD alarms at busy facilities that were going off due to low fuel as opposed to environmental issues. And then they sustained it because when they were getting to the root cause of these issues, they were able to actually address them the first time with a service call, as opposed to sending someone out multiple times, because they'd go out on an emergency basis thinking it was, some kind of, terrible issue. They'd arrive, they'd rush there, they didn't have the tools to fix it. They had to go back to the warehouse, come back again, it's double trip, all this sort of stuff. And so what we ended up seeing was a massive reduction in maintenance spend without any kind of reduction in the risk of compliance related issues, because of the fact that they had this technology that was helping them get to the root cause in essentially real time, as opposed to relying on an inexperienced environmental analyst just hitting blindly dispatch, which gets very expensive, as those of you who operate retail sites will know. So I thought this was a really powerful example of the impact that technology can have in terms of keeping facilities both compliant but also in a cost-effective way, reducing their maintenance spend without necessarily having an impact on the risk.
John, years ago, I did a kind of pre-Titan, free when all this architecture was already out there. I did a study years ago for a chain for an entire state. And while the PLLD alarms were not uncommon, out of the 600 sites we looked at, I don't know if there were any PLLD shutdown alarms that were actually a line leak. And so it, again, a little bit of frustration with a lumping alarm conditions together and masking the fact. The good news is there weren't that many leaks, but the bad news is it looked a lot worse than what it was, kind of to your point here.
Exactly. And I think it's difficult when people say, I have all of, look at all these alarms, an inspector goes in, a regulator goes in and prints out the alarm history, and it looks like it's, a terribly operated facility where there's probably fuel, everywhere. But in reality, these alarms are being triggered by something that has nothing to do with any sort of leak. And so I just think that's, useful context for, regulators to understand, but also important for operators to know that this technology exists today, and it can save a substantial amount of headache, risk, and money if you're applying it appropriately.
A couple of comments here, kind of to the point of measurement error. So many older probes are not compatible with ethanol fuels, and the probes often give false water level readings. Is that I kind of thought we had gotten around that with better probes. Is that from
Mm.
your perspective, John? Is that still the case? Do we still have liquid level reading problems because of the presence of ethanol in fuels?
You know, it's not something I've heard much about. That's not to say it's not a problem. I don't want to discount, that without, further knowledge. I can certainly ask we've got a bunch of people at Titan who've got deep experience, on the operational side of all of this. I can get some perspective on that. And maybe as a follow-up, Ben, if you want to send something out to the audience here after the fact, I'd be happy to gather some information on that. But no, I can't say with any degree of confidence that
Okay.
that's something I'm seeing.
I mean, it's a point to consider in that if our instrumentation is not calibrated to the
Hmm.
items that it's looking for, that can easily lead to ignored alarms or non-alarms when there's actually an alarm event. I know that. I mean, early on when ethanol really first started coming on the scene, I know that the floats were not necessarily compatible with E85 and sometimes even E10. I thought companies like Veeder-Root had gotten around that. I'm kind of in your boat too, John. I would like to do a little bit more research. I'll get back to the group on that one.
Okay. Yeah, and again, I think the changing composition of fuel is something that we're starting to see, the kind of consequences of all of that. You hear about the corrosion issues and so on and so forth. I think that's something that we'll just have to kind of keep an eye on as the industry continues to evolve. But yeah, to that specific point, I'm afraid I don't have a super strong opinion.
Hey, Adam from EG America just linked on the Q&A box a Veeder-Root link to phase separation float system. So there's a resource out there, at least from one of the tank gauge manufacturers. Feel free to click on that and review that. I'll check that out after class.
Cool.
And then Brett Smith, my buddy from Montana. John, do you have recommended settings available for your tank monitors? Where would be a good place to check for these? That's
Just kind of best practices for what different alarm levels should be sort of set at.
Yeah, recommended settings available for your tank monitor. Brett, that's a little broad, I think.
I think I understand the question though. Kind of like best practices for what you'd want on a tank monitor for, we talked about the water level, right? Like,
Yeah.
should you've got right here like low level limit, high level limit, overfill limit, water level limit, leak alarm limit, like all these sorts of things. There are, the tank monitor manufacturers do provide recommended settings, and so those would be in the various tank monitor manufacturers' operating manuals. What we have found is that it kind of comes down to the customers or the retailers' sort of business needs, and it will also vary a little bit by site. In some cases, if you have a really busy site, you'll want to say, okay, we definitely want to make sure that our regular low product alert is set a little bit higher than our really slow moving site. And especially for the premium products, like we don't need to know about premium until, we've only got, maybe a day or two left and we barely sell any of it. So we don't really care about that. So it's tough to say. The grade of fuel, the busyness of the site, the type of the alarm, all of these things could be different factors that play into it. But in general, for things like, the compliance related ones, I would say that there are pretty standard settings that people would consider to be normal, and those can be found in the OEMs, kind of manufacturing. Also, the sort of the use guides, the manuals and stuff like that for the equipment.
Yeah, and they have to be dovetailed into the third-party certification settings too. So they have to be consistent with what their third-party certification is verified for, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good question. Cool. Well, that's so that kind of reaches the end of. I had some more stuff on inspections, but I kind of wanted to just keep it tight on alarms today. There's sort of lots going on with inspections, obviously as well. But I think really what I hope that the audience takes away today, for those who are in the regulatory community, alarm management is maybe more complicated and complex and expensive then meets the eye. And I think that for operators, even if it is more complicated and expensive and complex than meets the eye, there are some tools out there to help you apply technology in ways that can help you get it under control, because it is daunting. When you take on, when you grow your business, one of the things that you have to think about is, what are we going to do about the maintenance and compliance of all of this? And fortunately, technology has come a long way. It's been exciting to see the advances in both mitigating risk and addressing cost effectiveness of achieving compliance. And so certainly would be happy if people are interested in reaching out to chat further. But Ben's pretty plugged in with all the various vendors who may be out there with tools and solutions that might be the right fit for different organizations.
I'm curious if there's any either inspectors or operators or service technicians on the line that come across routine alarms that they don't understand or they're not quite clear about. I mean, what sort of alarms are we? I'm just kind of curious. I mean, it's a big group of folks. What kind of alarms are we still typically seeing out there? I would think that liquid in sumps is probably kind of a common alarm. Feel free to use the Q&A feature, folks, and be curious to see what sort of alarms we're still seeing out there. Inspectors, operators, or otherwise. Sure, we're seeing some out there.
Yeah, I mean,
okay, yeah. So probe out, sensor alarms, high water, PLLD shutdown, but pretty much
the usual.
The usual suspects. Yeah. So yeah, and so just for those who maybe don't know, probe out is not a environmental compliance violation because you're not ignoring a suspected release, but you're failing to be able to take the measurements for which your next leak detection test may be based upon. So it's an operational alarm that could turn into a compliance alarm if it fails to do its job.
That's a really important bit of context, Ben, because what we've often seen is that people will say, oh, I use remote tank monitoring and I filter out the stuff that doesn't have to do with compliance. And we say, what do you mean you filter out? Oh, I have some setting where I can just block those alarms from coming into my email or my notifications feed or whatever it might be. And we say, well, what happens when an operational alarm is related to compliance, maybe through a sequence of events? For instance, let's go back to PLLD, right? So if you've blocked all low product notifications from coming through and you get a PLLD alarm that's gone off, how are you going to be able to know in any kind of degree of real time that alarm was triggered by low product if you don't also happen to receive the low product alarm for the same tank at the same facility at the same time? If you do have that context, you can say, okay, I can infer here that because the PLLD alarm happened at the same time as a low product alarm in the same tank, it's more likely than not that my PLLD alarm was triggered by low product as opposed to an environmental release. And so by saying I'm not going to take into account any of the low product alarms because they're not compliance related, what you're doing is jeopardizing your ability to respond cost effectively and get to the root cause of the actual potential environmental issues. And so I think it's a very, although I get filtering is useful and helpful and all of that, what you really need is technology that can actually blend the issues together and reach a conclusion based on the data at hand, all of the data at hand, as opposed to picking and choosing which alarms you're going to respond to. Because like you said, a tank probe out alarm could become a problem that's compliance related, if that's not necessarily, looked at promptly.
Yes, thank you. Comment from Reggie, TMS. I think the industry needs to start discussing SIR backing up ATGs. We now recommend this process through tank management services. So maybe talk about ATGs as a collection instrument, either for leak detection or as a backup method for daily leak detection.
Well, I think what you're seeing is more and more people are looking at maybe not SIR as a backup for tank, for their compliance, but inventory reconciliation as a core part of their overall fuel operation. Because losing fuel, whether it's through an environmental leak or through theft or through whatever it might be, losing fuel is not good. Meter drift, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Losing fuel is not a good situation to be in if you're in the business of selling fuel, right? So I think what we're seeing is there are more and more people that are maybe not necessarily saying I'm going to do SIR as a backup to my, compliance, but I'm going to actually do it as a fundamental part of optimizing my fuel management. We talked on the very first, the hierarchy of needs slide around optimizing fuel. Managing variance is a critical piece of that, and that's a top operational priority of many retailers these days. And if there's a secondary benefit of also being able to detect in closer to real time any sort of potential environmental issue, then that's great. But I don't necessarily see people, only doing it for the purpose of compliance. It kind of gets back to, again, there are other priorities than just compliance at facilities. And so, I think the way to sell inventory variance reconciliation to operators is to say, this is going to cost you money if you're not keeping this under control. Anytime you've got this sort of drift here, that's a risk that you're losing fuel through theft or through some kind of loss. Just like you wouldn't want shrinkage inside your convenience store with Twinkies walking out the door, you don't want your fuel going somewhere unbeknownst to you either. So I think if that's a regulator, I don't know if that was a regulator or an operator asking that question, but I think, there's, fuel inventory variance and reconciliation is definitely becoming more of an an operational priority. And the fact that it's got this kind of bonus as being a backup for compliance is sort of a cherry on top, I think, from the perspective of retailers. And, maybe that's the way to get more industry buy-in to it.
On our webpage, John, I just recently published two news articles that was a complete throwback to the 90s. Both sites about 30,000 gallons of fuel lost, right? And it showed up in the beloved historic hotel basement in downtown Walla Walla, Washington. The basement full of fuel was their leak detection method. I mean, how can you lose 30,000 gallons of fuel and not know it? And also in Taunton, Massachusetts, same thing. I mean, catastrophic loss, and people had been smelling fuel for a while, kind of thing like that. And I was just really kind of taken aback. I kind of thought we were over those deadlines, and the two happened within about a week or two of each other.
It's crazy to still be hearing about that in 2023. But I think that it gets back to one of my issues with SIR is that it's not real. It's not even close to real time. And we're seeing some very impressive development of new technologies that are allowing people to get variance readings, really, really promptly. With very, very rapid readings coming in from the tank monitor, because, sending something off for approval, getting it back 30 days later, by the time you got it back, you might have 30,000 gallons of fuel in the hotel basement because, you haven't been able to take action on it. It's I think there's issues with, nothing's perfect, but SIR can be a pretty long lag between when the event takes place and when the action to fix it is able to be recognized.
And real quick, someone said they weren't able to read the VitaRoot link that was posted in the Q&A box. I will send everyone a copy of that after this call. And then maybe in closing, when it comes to in-tank water alarms, despite the benefits of technology and ATG capabilities, a good old tank stick with water paste is an effective way to test this. Tank stick will never need batteries charged or software upgrade.
That is a good point. You do need someone to do it, though, and labor can be hard to come by sometimes. So, I think
if they do it the same way, the same time of day,
exactly.
I'm with you, Adam. I think seeing is believing, and having a stick is good, but yeah, there is measurement error stuff to consider for sure.
Yep, absolutely. And then just the last thing, for those stay in touch with the team at Titan. We will be at the Sigma annual conference in November in Orlando. If any of you will be there, we'll have some representatives on site, so feel free to reach out. And we're on LinkedIn and all that good stuff. But I really appreciate, Ben, you inviting me to share this with your audience today. Thank you again for everybody for joining. Obviously, it's great to do these things. It's great to have the level of engagement that we had, even though it was remote. So thank you, those of you who contributed questions. We'll certainly look forward to any follow-ups that Ben and I have got will come out after the fact. But appreciate everyone's time today, and Ben, appreciate you as always.
Thank you, my friend.